Hi, everybody. Dr. Woeller checking in here for the Great Plains Laboratory complimentary monthly webinar. So the title of this lecture is Clinical Considerations of Elevated Pyroglutamic Acid that is seen on the organic acids test. And this is it's a complicated topic, but it is something that is worth considering when you start doing organic acid tests more consistently, because you will see a fair amount of people who have high levels of pyroglutamic. So this will be a little bit of a shorter webinar that I typically do, but we're going to get into some specifics. And really what I hope is by the end of this, you just come away with it with just a greater appreciation for what the overall organic acid test provides, but also this particular marker and just some things to think about in your practice. So I have been a integrative and functional medicine physician since the late 90s, 1998, exactly when I first started practicing in San Diego, California, and first got introduced to functional medicine. And I've been doing clinical education now for Great Plains Lab through their GPL Academy for a number of years. I actually designed the organic acid test training seminar, which is an introduction to the fundamental interpretation of the organic acid test. And I've also spoken on topics of autism and other integrated medicine types of things throughout the United States as well as internationally. I'm a practicing clinician. I've specialized in autism spectrum disorders for over 20 years and have worked with patients with autoimmune and gastrointestinal neurological disorders, etc. I'm also the co-founder of Integrative Medicine Academy, which I'll talk about here shortly, as well as a co-founder of a website we have. It's a membership site actually for healthcare practitioners called Functional Medicine Clinical Rounds, which allows practitioners to consult with us directly if they like, as well as access other educational information that's on that website. So much of the information that we're going to talk about in this lecture comes from my advanced OAT Mastery course, which is a comprehensive online course that goes through every marker on the organic acid test in a very in-depth way. And then also I pulled a little information from my toxicity mastery course, which is all about chemical toxins, metal toxins, mycotoxins, etc. So pyroglutamic, pyroglutamic acid, this is the chemical that we see under the indicators of detoxification section of the OAT. So, and it is representative here with an asterisk next to it. So you probably remember if you look at an organic acid test, like for example, under the nutritional marker section, there are 4 markers that have an asterisk next to them, which means they're indirect, meaning that when that marker is high, it's indicating a deficiency of that respective nutrient. Well, the same thing applies for pyroglutamic. When pyroglutamic is elevated, like we see here above the second standard deviation line, it gets any of these markers on the OAT that when it's high, gets wrapped in a red diamond. That indicates that glutathione is deficient. So elevations of pyroglutamic indicate a glutathione deficiency. And one of the things I talk about in the organic acid test training seminars is when you see an elevation of pyroglutamic, you should automatically start thinking, why is this happening? What could be driving the problem or multiple problems of why pyroglutamic would be high? So you have to start asking those questions to try to figure out perhaps where to go next. Now, some of that can be based on your clinical intake. What's the patient taking? What are they being exposed to? What is their lifestyle like? And then, of course, other factors that could be related to chemicals, et cetera, that we'll talk about. So the 2 markers here is pyroglutamic and 2-hydroxybutyric. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about 2-hydroxybutyric because the most common reason that 2-hydroxybutyric is high is an increased demand to maintain glutathione levels. So basically the person's being exposed, or their detoxification system is stressed, and so their body's trying to maintain glutathione. There are some other reasons that are linked to the methylation cycle, for example, that are less common. And then something to note is that 2-hydroxybutyric is a marker. If you actually look this up, it is a marker that can be linked to blood sugar issues, or essentially insulin dysregulation, for example. So it is a marker that actually has some relationship there. But again, the most common reason is basically an increased need for glutathione. So we know that pyroglutamic elevations is a reflection of glutathione deficiency. 2-hydroxybutyric elevation is most commonly linked to an increased demand for glutathione production. So pyroglutamic stands for, or another name for it is 5-oxoproline. Get in the habit of, whenever you see pyroglutamic elevated on the OAT, to look at the interpretation section. And it's just so that you get an appreciation for the various things that can cause this marker to be high. And then think about prioritization of what's most common, and then what would be sort of very rare, least commonly seen or encountered. Okay, so the most common scenario of an intracellular glutathione deficiency is often due to somebody using acetaminophen, or what's called paracetamol if you're overseas. And in some cases, just even short-term use of acetaminophen can cause pyroglutamic to be elevated. So it should be a question you're asking patients: have you taken acetaminophen recently? And sometimes you'll see that with kids who were put on acetaminophen for a fever, for example. Now, there are less common reasons that this thing could be elevated. There are certain antibiotics that can cause it to be high. Okay, that basically means they deplete glutathione. And then there's different things downstream from there. Okay, chemical exposures and mold exposures, for example, could deplete glutathione in the body. And then even less common than that would be more genetic factors. A deficiency in oxoprolinase, for example, okay, could lead to an increase of pyroglutamic. Prematurity glycine deficiencies, for example, things that might show up or occur in infants. But again, that would be a more rare type of scenario. And we'll talk about some other scenarios too, because things that would cause, or a genetic deficiency in glutathione synthase, for example, could lead to an increase in 5-oxoproline. So basically, when you look at a slide like this, if you've got a deficiency of glutathione, it is going to translate into an increase of pyroglutamic. And then there's a lot of moving parts in between that we'll get into. So pyroglutamic is a derivative of glutamic acid, or its conjugate base called glutamate. So when glutamic acid loses a hydrogen, for example, it becomes a base. And we know that it's linked to glutathione status. Elevated levels could be associated again with glutamine or glutathione metabolism. Sometimes in some of the charts, they'll either show glutamate or glutamine as the amino acid that combines with cysteine and then combines with glycine to form glutathione. So I'll show you a couple examples of that. Pyroglutamic can also get produced by an enzyme called gamma-glutamyl cyclotransferase. Now, chronically high levels of pyroglutamic can be associated with various genetic disorders. Okay, as I mentioned, a deficiency in oxoprolinase. Okay, if that enzyme, that's the enzyme that helps to break down, or it should say really convert pyroglutamic. And then a deficiency in glutathione synthase, for example. This is what combines glycine with cysteine. And again, these would tend to be more rare type of what are sometimes considered to be inborn errors of metabolism. So let's take just a little bit of a deeper dive here and look at a couple scenarios. Here's our 5-oxoproline, so that is our pyroglutamic. We know that a deficiency of glutathione, however it occurs, whether it's getting used up quickly before it can be regenerated, or it's just not getting produced adequately along, sometime along the way or along these chemical reactions, that will lead to an increase of 5-oxoproline. So glutamate actually will get transported into the cell, and through the actions of an enzyme called gamma-glutamyl amino acid and gamma-glutamyl cyclotransferase, it forms pyruvic acid, or pyroglutamic. 5-oxoproline or pyroglutamic gets converted through the actions of 5-oxoprolinase to glutamine. Now, like I mentioned, in some of the charts, they'll list this as glutamate. But glutamine or glutamate combines with cysteine through the actions of gamma-glutamyl cysteine synthase to become gamma-glutamyl cysteine. Gamma-glutamyl cysteine, in some of the literature you'll read, is they consider it to be the rate limiting step in glutathione production, will combine with the amino acid glycine to become glutathione under the directions of glutathione synthase. If there is some kind of a defect in the glutathione synthase, that can cause the gamma-glutamyl cysteine, to build up, and it'll get reconverted back to pyroglutamic under the directions of gamma-glutamyl cyclotransferase. Okay, so that could be one reason that you see high levels of pyroglutamic. We know that if we block or there's a genetic defect in the oxoprolinase, that can also cause pyroglutamic to go up. It certainly would be possible to have a deficiency of cysteine. That could cause our pyroglutamic to go up as well, or even a deficiency of glutamine or glutamate could cause an increase in pyroglutamic. You might even make the case that a glycine deficiency could lead to a problem there as well. Now, there is a feedback loop when we have adequate amounts of glutathione. It'll actually feed back on our gamma-glutamyl synthase to kind of slow it down. It has a regulatory function on that. Okay, but by and large, this is sort of the gist of what can lead to increased levels of 5-oxoproline. And understand that a deficiency of some of these enzymes would be more of a rare type of circumstance with regards to a cause for elevations of pyroglutamic. So here's a different view, okay? And the other way to think about this system is think of it as a cycle called the gamma-glutamyl cycle. And it's a way for the cell to try to maintain glutathione levels as best as it can within our cells so that glutathione can do what it's supposed to do, act as an antioxidant, help with detoxification, help protect our mitochondria, for example. This enzyme called gamma-glutamyl transpeptidase. This is an enzyme that sits right in the mitochondrial, not the mitochondrial, but the plasma membrane. And so extracellular glutathione, okay, that's approaching a cell. The gamma-glutamyl transpeptidase will basically break the bond, okay? I'm trying to get rid of this screen up top. I can't, for some reason, that thing is blocking my view. But it breaks the bond from a chemical component within glutathione that helps to form glutamate. And then this complex gets taken into the cell, okay, through this transporter, this amino acid transporter. And so as we enter the cell as cysteine glycine and basically glutamate, or basically a glutamate combination here. So it's interesting is that the cysteine glycine gets split apart, and the glycine goes off in its own direction, and the cysteine goes off in its own direction. The glutamate amino acid, okay, combines with this gamma-glutamyl cyclotransferase to become 5-oxoproline. And then we get this amino acid conversion. Usually this is a glutamate that comes off. Through the actions of 5-oxoprolinase, okay, under the direction of ATP, so we actually need ATP from our mitochondria to make this conversion happen, it recombines or reforms glutamate. The glutamate and cysteine come together under the direction of glutamate cysteine ligase, okay, and with another ATP as part of the process. And it forms the rate limiting step chemical called gamma-glutamyl cysteine. That then combines with glycine under the direction of glutathione synthase to become gamma-glutamyl cystinyl glycine, otherwise known as glutathione. And notice we have ATP happening here at 3 different steps. Turns out that glutathione synthase is a magnesium-dependent enzyme as well. This is another view. Okay, so glutathione, whether it's staying internal within the cell or gets taken extracellular and then taken into another cell, if it has to come back into a cell, it will get broken down by the gamma-glutamyl transpeptidase into a cysteine-glycine combo, as well as a glutamate amino acid. These are then transported into the cell. And so now the glutamate becomes the pyroglutamic. We know that the cysteine and the glycine through a dipeptidase enzyme gets split apart. So it basically breaks apart that complex to form glycine and cysteine. The 5-oxoprolinase starts to convert 5-oxoproline to form L-glutamate. And then these two pair up. Glutamate cysteine pairs up. And then our glycine combines here as well. Sometimes the enzyme gets called a ligase, sometimes it's called a synthetase. But either way, the combination of glutamate plus cysteine makes our gamma-glutamyl cysteine. Okay, and just think of that as sort of the rate limiting step here. Then these two guys combine to make glutathione. And then if we have adequate glutathione, it will feed back on the gamma-glutamyl cysteine synthase or the gamma-glutamyl cysteine ligase, whatever it's called, okay, to sort of slow down this reaction. This is an important thing right here. The gamma-glutamyl cysteine is, I'll show you that it's actually suspected that certain aldehyde compounds can actually inhibit this. And so when we look at a slide like this, we can think, okay, if we just completely destroy our glutathione, that'll cause our pyroglutamic to go up. If we're deficient in cysteine, that would cause it to go up. If we're very deficient in glutamate, that could cause it to go up. And the same thing with glycine. Of course, if we have a deficiency or some kind of defect in our glutathione synthase, that could cause a problem. Or we have a genetic defect in our 5-oxoprolinase, that all of those things could lead to an increase of pyroglutamic. And then just one more view of this, it's fairly similar, okay? But think of it as a recycling system, which we know glutathione is. And it takes a lot of steps, right? So here is our 5-oxoproline. So this is our pyroglutamic. If we're deficient in glutamate, if we're deficient in cysteine, if we're deficient in glycine, all of that could compromise glutathione production. So here is our end product. It certainly would be possible if somebody were severely mitochondrial compromised, that if we had major drops in ATP, well, that might also contribute. Usually when you're thinking of a glutathione deficiency and elevations of pyroglutamic, it's usually not just one factor doing it. It could be a combination of things. Okay, so just a different viewpoint here. But also understand that even just appropriate, what's considered to be therapeutic use of acetaminophen. This was actually an article out of the Royal College of Physicians. So in the UK and around the world, they call it paracetamol, but it's acetaminophen. Even just appropriate uses can cause excess pyroglutamic. So again, always go back and ask people, have you been taking acetaminophen or any other medication that might have acetaminophen in it? So when we think about Great Plains and some of the other tests that they offer, we know that many of the things in the organic acid test can put stress on the detoxification systems of the body, including that of glutathione. People who have a lot of yeast overgrowth or fungal overgrowth, particularly bacterial overgrowth, nutritional imbalances could be contributing factors to biochemical stress at the cellular level. Chemical toxins, whether it's organophosphates, whether it's other chemicals that we're exposed to, and certainly mycotoxins could play a role. And then the reality is, in people who are very complex, it could be multiple factors, usually not just one thing. And when you think about the liver and what the liver is doing from a detoxification standpoint, we've got phase 1, which is our P450 enzymes, for example. Okay, and this is that beginning transformation of what are called lipid-soluble compounds, things that are basically being stored or dissolvable, if you will, in lipid layers. So it gets into our fatty tissue, for example. And so phase 1, primarily through what's called the oxidation, reduction, and hydrolysis reactions, attempts to start to convert these lipid-soluble compounds into more water-soluble. And there's always an intermediary phase. And for all of this intermediary phase is a place of great vulnerability, because we can actually generate a lot of reactive oxygen species, which I'll show you a picture of this. And this can cause a lot of cellular damage. So we need a fair amount of antioxidants to help protect against oxidative stress, free radical formation. And then once we get into phase 2, this is where our sulfation, what's called glucuronidation, and then our glutathione conjugation is really important. Using glutathione to combine with a chemical to make it less toxic, essentially trying to convert these things to water-soluble compounds so they can be excreted from our body in our stool, in our urine. And so basically the role of phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification is to basically what's called unmask or alter a functional group on a respective chemical. And then all of these different types of chemical reactions, hydrolysis, conjugation, sulfation, for example, are what do that for us. So let me just show you just a quick example. This is a chemical off the GPL tox profile called propylene oxide, and the metabolite, meaning the metabolite that was formed based on the conjugation reaction, essentially, that takes place in the liver, is called N-acetyl 2-hydroxypropylcysteine. And this, I'm actually taking some of this information from my Toxicity Mastery course, but propylene oxide is a chemical that you see elevated fairly commonly in people. In fact, when my wife and I had done a GPL tox a few years ago, we had elevations of propylene oxide. And we figured it was probably coming from, at that time, we would buy a lot of our produce from a store where they actually, a lot of the produce was in bags, for example. And they use this as a fumigant. Okay, so for nuts and fruits and other, types of produce, for example. And so it's something that a lot of us can be exposed to. So we actually shifted trying to buy more of our produce from an organic store that, basically had produce that was not already prepackaged. So again, it's a fairly common marker for people to have high. And we can see in this particular individual, propylene oxide levels are very, very elevated, well above the 95th percentile on this test. Now, it is used in the textile industry and the construction industry. So it could be used in lubricants and surfactants, for example. But again, it's a common thing added, okay, to act as a fungicide and insecticide, etc. So unfortunately, it is a probable human carcinogen. Okay, so the way it's listed here. And its chemical structure is something called an epoxide. And basically, these are very reactive chemicals where you've got primarily an oxygen bound to two different carbons. And there's a lot of strain within that chemical bonding sequence that makes this a very reactive chemical. But through the process of oxidation, we need good glutathione conjugation in order to break it down and get rid of it. Okay, so here's an example of propylene oxide, right, that gets converted through glutathione into different, derivatives or metabolites to eventually become our N-acetylcysteine compound. And that's what gets dumped in the urine and then measured on the organic acid test. But if we have poor glutathione status, which could cause pyroglutamic to be high, well, one of the reasons is that we have a lot of chemical exposure. So as we add more chemicals to our system, we're going to be occupying more of the glutathione that our body can make. And some people have problems even making it adequately. And then at other times you can make it fine, but you have so much chemical exposure happening that you're just using it up too quickly. This is another chemical called permethrin. These tend to be what are called pyrethroid insecticides. A lot of times these are found in like pet shampoo, for example. And the bottom line is that these chemicals generate a lot of oxidative stress, primarily by creating what are called reactive oxygen species. And again, I'll show you a picture of this here shortly. And these chemicals tend to damage our mitochondria or affect metabolism or alter enzyme reactivity. And then runaway oxidative stress can damage our DNA, can damage cytoskeletal function, inhibit ATP synthesis, and then ultimately lead to a glutathione deficiency. If we think about what a free radical is, okay, whether it's a reactive oxygen species or some other element, the basic idea of an element, okay, on the periodic table, for example, is that it wants in its outer shell, called the valence shell. So if we took oxygen, for example, oxygen has 6 electrons in its valence shell, and it wants 2 more electrons to be stable. And basically all of these elements are trying to get to what's called a noble gas. And a noble gas has 8 electrons in its outer shell. So it's most stable and most happy at that point. So oxygen has 6 electrons in its valence shell. So it wants 2 more electrons to be stable. And so it's quite easy to actually form what are called oxide or oxygen anions. So for example, we have a superoxide anion or a peroxide or a hydroxyl radical, for example, and they may contain 1 or more unpaired electrons. So in this particular example, we can see this free radical has 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 electrons in its valence shell. So it wants 1 more in order to be stable. So it's going to act as a free radical. It's going to go grab an electron from something else. It could grab it from another atom. It could grab it from a protein. It could grab it from a cell membrane, or it could grab it from our DNA. Okay, so it's going to grab that electron to fill its valence shell, making itself happy and stable, but leaving tissue damage, as it moves on. Okay, so it leaves a lot of debris or a lot of collateral damage. And so just from a visual standpoint, that's what free radical damage is. Okay, it doesn't have to be an oxygen, but reactive oxygen species are doing the same thing. Okay, for example, this superoxide anion has an unpaired electron. So it wants, it's basically going to seek out an additional electron to help make it more stable. So we've got basically these oxide anions, which we know can act as free radicals, and we've got different enzyme systems that should help to take care of it as best as possible. So superoxide dismutase, for example, that will convert superoxide anion into hydrogen peroxide. But we know hydrogen peroxide has its own volatility. In fact, it can actually break down and convert into a hydroxyl ion, which itself can act as a free radical. Catalase, for example, is an enzyme that helps to convert hydrogen peroxide to water and oxygen. We also need glutathione peroxidase, basically to break down hydrogen peroxide into water. Okay, so again, deficiencies in glutathione or different steps along the process of glutathione production or recycling can leave us vulnerable to these oxidative compounds. One of the things to keep in mind about chemical exposure, whether it's exogenous exposure or things that we even produce in our own body, are chemicals called aldehydes. And aldehydes have a chemical group where we've got a carbon double bonded to an oxygen with a hydrogen off of one end. And these aldehydes are very reactive. In fact, many of the enzymes that exist in the P450 system of phase 1 are really active against aldehyde functional groups, because too many of these aldehydes can damage our DNA, can damage protein, can damage mitochondria, can lead to what's called lipid peroxidation or deplete glutathione. And there's many different types of enzymes that exist in the P450 system of phase 1 detox. And there's different types of enzymes that deal with these aldehydes. Okay, this particular one called oxoreductase helps to break down acetaldehyde and other types of aldehydes, formaldehyde, for example. And, I'm not going to get into every layer of this, but it gets fairly complex, but it's quite interesting in that certain chemicals like acrolein, for example. Acrolein was one of the newer compounds that was added to the GPL tox profile, for example. And acrolein is an environmental pollutant. So it's used as an herbicide, and it's used in many different chemical industries as well. So it can be, sometimes you'll see acrolein elevated in people who smoke cigarettes, for example. So I actually had a situation where I saw about 4 different markers on the GPL tox that were elevated, including acrolein, in a child who was being exposed to an individual in their household who smoked, or at least that was certainly suspected of causing that. Acrolein is an algicide, so sometimes they'll add it to like water aqueducts, for example. So I'm tending to see a fair amount of aldehyde elevations, by the way, in people. Interestingly, is that certain Clostridia bacteria can produce acrolein. So that's just something to consider here when you're looking at, let's say, the organic acid test. If the Clostridia markers are high, that might be a reason why the acrolein was elevated. But I think probably by and large, the vast majority of people's acrolein levels are coming because of environmental chemicals. Now, realize that this chemical has aldehydes. Okay, so that by definition, a carbon with a hydrogen double bonded oxygen is an aldehyde. And so these aldehydes are fairly ubiquitous in our environment, okay, from environmental pollutants as well as things that we produce in our own body. So acrolein can be, again, due to food and water contamination, cigarette smoke, automobile exhaust, biocide use, that would be basically like an algicide. And just kind of remember that this group, this chemical group, is fairly reactive chemically. So reactions at a organic acid level, again, can generate DNA damage, protein damage, oxidative stress, mitochondrial damage. Very interesting article that came out a few years back talking about aldehyde toxicity in autism. In fact, one of the things that they mention here is that some of the side effects of alcohol consumption. So for any of us who've maybe had one too many on a Friday or Saturday night, right? You wake up the next morning or even the middle of the night and you don't feel so hot. You've got some facial flushing, you're nauseous, the rapid heartbeat, kind of those unpleasant side effects of alcohol. Well, they're actually thought to occur because of the accumulation of acetaldehyde. So ethanol, when we consume ethanol, a byproduct or a midway point is acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde eventually gets converted into acetic acid. But it's interesting, in the glucose metabolism of yeast cells, yeast will actually convert glucose and they'll convert it into acetaldehyde, which then gets converted into ethanol. So we convert ethanol into acetaldehyde into acetic acid. Okay. Yeast cells, or candida, for example, will take glucose, convert it into acetaldehyde, and then into ethanol. Either way, whether you're consuming ethanol or producing ethanol internally because of a major fungal overgrowth, there is the potential for increasing acetaldehyde. And what this article is talking about is just some of the toxic effects of not only acetaldehyde, but other aldehyde type compounds. And so this is a big problem we know in autism, and it's certainly a big problem in other individuals with just major problems linked to fungal overgrowth. At least that's certainly suspected. And then it goes on from there. And why I'm including it in this talk is in this article, there was actually an article that came out in 2003 in Alcohol Clinical Research, I think it was called, where they talked about the fact that the rate limiting step for glutathione production, remember, is this gamma glutamyl cysteine complex. That's where cysteine comes together with glutamate. And then, of course, we combine glycine with it to become glutathione. Well, it turns out that aldehyde, okay, appears to be able to bind not to the glutathione, but bind or interfere with the gamma glutamyl cysteine complex. So there's multiple things that can obviously impact these systems biochemically. It appears that one of them could certainly be acetaldehyde. And if it's acetaldehyde, there's always that possibility that perhaps other aldehydes might do it as well. So another thing, obviously, we want to ask our patients is alcohol consumption, right? I mean, is that a problem for them when we're taking our intake? And then, of course, in pretty much anybody is trying to assess them from a fungal standpoint. Let me say a few things about N-acetylcysteine. So on the organic acid test, this is now found under the nutritional marker section. there's a marker for N-acetylcysteine, and it's actually fairly common to see levels that show up as zeros on the test. And a lot of people interpret that as that you're totally deficient in N-acetylcysteine. And I'll admit, it's kind of a confusing thing to conceptualize because it doesn't seem correct. But it's actually a fairly common phenomena and is actually considered, from my understanding of how the test operates, is that it's showing us that there is likely adequate amount of N-acetylcysteine that is getting converted to glutathione. So N-acetylcysteine is a precursor to cysteine, right? So we've got cysteine plus glutamate plus glycine makes glutathione. And we know that there's a lot of enzymes in between, and we need ATP in order to make it happen. And we know that gamma glutamylcysteine is a really central point in glutathione production, and that this can be taken out, for example, as I just mentioned, by acetaldehyde. Well, in order to get N-acetylcysteine to become cysteine, we need to do what's called a deacetylation reaction. And that is where this acetyl group right here gets taken off. Okay, so this group is removed and N-acetylcysteine becomes cysteine. And so now it can easily combine with cysteine and glutamate to become glutathione. Well, there's always the possibility, albeit from what I've seen relatively rare, is that the enzyme that makes it happen, and I know of one, I don't know if there are others, but it's called acylase, which is needed to deacetylate N-acetylcysteine to make it cysteine, perhaps is malfunctioning. Now, it is a zinc-dependent enzyme. Okay, so, and I don't know if there could be other factors that might interfere with the function of the enzyme, for example. And what I'm showing you is not a common phenomenon. It's just something to appreciate if you do see this type of scenario. Because if we got a defect in the acylase enzyme, we're going to have a problem deacetylating N-acetylcysteine to cysteine, and then of course that is going to compromise our glutathione production. Every once in a while, and albeit it's rare, at least in my experience, you can see elevations of N-acetylcysteine on the test. Now, the first thing that you would do if that were the case is ask somebody, are you taking N-acetylcysteine as a supplement? Because if they are, then that's probably why it's high. If they aren't, which was the case in this person, we can see that their N-acetylcysteine levels are elevated and their pyroglutamic levels are elevated too. So there's likely a problem in deacetylating the N-acetylcysteine to make glutathione. And so in this kind of scenario, this would be one of these kind of areas you'd have to question, well, maybe we wouldn't use N-acetylcysteine as a supplement, and perhaps we just give the end product glutathione to kind of bypass any problem there. By and large, most people don't have any issues in converting N-acetylcysteine to glutathione. So you can get pretty good, easy conversion. It's an inexpensive way of trying to boost glutathione levels, usually well tolerated. Of course, you can use liposomal glutathione, for example, to give the end product, and there's nothing wrong with that. But not everybody can afford that long term, and so N-acetylcysteine works, very well. As we can see in this particular circumstance, we've got high N-acetylcysteine, high pyroglutamic. So the high pyroglutamic is showing us that we have a glutathione deficiency, and we have a high level of 2-hydroxybutyric, which means the body is trying to, it's prioritizing, it's trying to make more glutathione. It's trying to pump more of it out, and in the process, we're getting an elevation of 2-hydroxybutyric as a reflection of that reaction. So when you look at these slides, just keep sort of the big picture in mind. Try and focus on what would be the most common reason, again, of why glutathione could be impaired and how that could relate to an elevations of pyroglutamic. For most of us in clinical practice, in a standard integrated functional medicine practice, it's not likely you're going to see, severe inborn errors in metabolism that would be affecting glutathione synthase or affecting, oxoprolinase, for example. You could have somebody who's really, really deficient in amino acids. They've got a really bad gut, really bad diet, in a very severe form, that things like cysteine, glycine, or even glutamate might be a bit compromised. And then go through your checklist, right? We know that a major depleter of glutathione is Tylenol use. Okay, so if that is in the equation, that needs to be taken into consideration. We can now see where chemicals could interfere. Mycotoxins are another big one that can interfere. Heavy metals would certainly put a strain on glutathione levels. And then, over time too, like fungal overgrowth, bacterial overgrowth, other nutritional deficiencies could compromise the system as well. So just always try and ask the questions, why is this happening? And see if there's anything you could pick up from your clinical intake, or if there's areas that you feel you might need to dive in deeper from an additional testing standpoint. Chemicals, for example, like the GPL tox, mycotox profile, for example. So as I mentioned, our advanced OAT Mastery course is a very in-depth course. It's a 12-module course that goes into the organic acid test in a very in-depth way. And what I just presented to you here is just a snippet of information actually taken from one lecture within that course. So if this is of interest to you, we do have a new course starting Wednesday, March 31st, coming up here in about a week. If you would like to get some additional information about it, you can text the word AOAT to 66866. You can also go to advancedoatmasterycourse.com. There's early bird discounts, these types of things. If you have gone through the organic acid test training seminar through the GPL Academy, then you would be primed to take this course. If you took my essential organic acid test training through our Integrated Medicine Academy, then this would be the next easy segue for you. If you're a practitioner who has not done any training on the organic acid test, but you've used it in your practice for years and you feel relatively comfortable with it from just a basic, foundational level, then taking the advanced OAT Mastery course would be, I think, easy for you to do. So again, this course starts here in about a week. We also have a website called Functional Medicine Clinical Rounds. This is a membership site for healthcare practitioners, and this is an opportunity for you as a healthcare practitioner, if you would like to consult with me or my partner, Dr. Trancatella, more directly on lab test reviews, on clinical cases, troubleshooting scenarios. We actually have a one-on-one lab consult service through this website. And we also have other educational material. We have bi-weekly videos that we produce. We have a monthly clinical rounds webinar that also is part of this website. The Functional Medicine Clinical Rounds site is not a course. This is a membership site for just ongoing access, but there is some educational material in there. We actually have a number of sections, again, booking consults. We have a forum, so we actually have an interactive forum for practitioners to post questions to us through that section. And then we have a section in what's called clinical data sheets. These are one-page PDF downloadable documents that take a lab test or a part of a lab test. It could be a hair metal analysis, a hormone profile, a mycotox, and it gives specific indications of what those markers mean and some clinical information around that. So any If you're interested in that, you can go to functionalmedicineclinicalrounds.com. Okay, everybody, thanks so much for your attention. I hope you found this information interesting. If you have any additional questions about some of our courses through Integrated Medicine Academy, you can email to integratedmedicineacademy@gmail.com. I'm Dr. Kurt Woeller. I want to thank Great Plains again for sponsoring these monthly webinars. We'll all talk again and see you all soon. Thanks so much.